On this Sunday night, the world's COVID-19 caseload climbs to new heights. More than 25 million confirmed cases as the pandemic's epicenter moves east. And as students return to school, our team of medical experts is standing by to answer your COVID-19 questions.
There's definitely anxiety in those kids who are going in person, but also remote learning. Police in Portland provide an update after a pro-Trump demonstration turned deadly. And kite fright. Video captures a close call for a little girl in Taiwan after a kite festival took a terrifying turn.
Global National with Robin Gill. Reporting tonight, Jeff Semple.
Good evening and thank you for joining us. We begin tonight with what appears to be a shift in the global fight against COVID-19. The number of reported cases worldwide just surpassed 25 million, with the U.S. and Brazil still topping the grim tally. But as David Akin reports, the epicenter of the pandemic may soon be shifting from the U.S. to India.
No country has had more infections than the United States. The latest data compiled by Johns Hopkins University shows that the U.S. easily leads the world in COVID-19 cases and deaths. As of Sunday morning, nearly 6 million Americans have been infected, and more than 180,000 have died. Brazil is second in the world with more than 3.8 million cases and more than 120,000 deaths. India has the third highest number of cases at more than 3.5 million and over 63,000 deaths. The Johns Hopkins data has Canada 24th in the world with just under 130,000 cases and more than 9,100 deaths. India, though, has recently seen case numbers surge. On Sunday, the country recorded 78,761 cases, and that eclipsed the all-time record globally for cases in a single day. That had been set by the U.S. in mid-July.
Everybody was out there without wearing a mask, without any social distancing, without any sanitizers, basically just gay abandon. Everybody thought that everything is over and we are back to square one. That is something that we should not have allowed to have happened.
Despite India's surging case numbers, Prime Minister Narendra Modi is pushing to get things back to normal. Underground train networks are about to open, and sports and religious events will soon be allowed in a limited manner. And while non-essential travel to Canada is still banned, the frequency of Canada-India flights recently increased. That said, all travelers arriving in Canada, no matter where they're from, must still quarantine for 14 days upon their arrival. Meanwhile, the World Health Organization said that with 25 million cases worldwide, the official number is now at least 5 times the number of severe flu cases that are recorded every year. And the continued global spread of the virus is one reason why the Canadian government extended border shutdowns and travel restrictions at least until the end of September. David Akin, Global News, Ottawa.
And coming up later in the program, we'll tackle your questions about COVID-19, including concerns about kids heading back to school. Our experts weigh in on stress, face shields, and what to do if your child develops symptoms. The police shooting of Jacob Blake in the United States last week has sparked outrage not only in America, but right around the world. Today in London, hundreds took part in an anti-racism rally dubbed the Million People March to show their support for the Black Lives Matter movement. Demonstrators lay down on a road outside Notting Hill Tube Station to block traffic. And violent and at times deadly protests have erupted across the U.S. as people demand justice for Jacob Blake and an end to police brutality. This week, President Trump will visit Kenosha, where Blake was shot 7 times by police. Trump is running his re-election campaign on law and order, labeling protesters thugs. And as Jennifer Johnson reports, his visit is expected to add even more fuel to the fire.
It's been a week of protests and anger after a Kenosha, Wisconsin police officer was videoed shooting 29-year-old Jacob Blake in the back 7 times during an arrest.
No justice, no peace.
Now the White House says President Trump will visit law enforcement officers in Kenosha, the first time he's visited a city in turmoil after a police-involved shooting.
The president's on the side of law enforcement and the rule of law, and he's been very consistent in that.
On Twitter Sunday, the president repeatedly threatened to send in the National Guard to clamp down on demonstrators. In Portland overnight, one person was shot and killed during clashes between protesters and counter-protesters as that city faced unrest for the 94th night in a row.
Do you seriously wonder, Mr. President, why this is the first time in decades that America has seen this level of violence? It's you who have created the hate and the division.
Minneapolis was again hit with more looting 3 months after George Floyd's death. Protesters and D.C. police clashed late Saturday at the new Black Lives Matter plaza. Democrats are pointing the finger of blame directly at the president.
This is a time, more now than ever, that we need to hear from the President of the United States. But the chaos and the disorder and the lawlessness that we are currently seeing, that's Donald Trump's America.
Kenosha's mayor is appealing for calm, but says the protesters need to be heard.
The concern is that there is an issue of fairness and equity in their minds.
Wisconsin's attorney general says officers tried to stop Blake with tasers, but couldn't.
Mr. Blake acknowledged subsequent to this incident that he had a knife in his possession.
But no explanation is stopping the anger over racial inequity that has swept across America. The White House hasn't said if the president will meet with Blake's family in a further effort to diffuse tensions. Jennifer Johnson, Global News, Washington.
The toppling of a statue of John A. Macdonald in Montreal is sparking strong political reaction from across the country. It happened yesterday during a Defund the Police rally. Protesters pulled down the monument of Canada's first Prime Minister over his mistreatment of Indigenous people. The statue's head snapped right off and has since been removed from the site. Quebec Premier François Legault tweeted, "Vandalism has no place in our democracy and the statue must be restored." The incident even provoked an offer from Alberta. Premier Jason Kenney tweeting, "We would be happy to receive the statue for installation on the grounds of Alberta's legislature." To Belarus now, where defiant protesters took to the streets for a third straight Sunday following the country's contentious presidential election. Tens of thousands marched in the capital, Minsk, despite warnings from the government. Reports say more than 100 protesters were arrested. And as Mike Armstrong reports, the crackdown comes as the president received a birthday call from his Russian counterpart.
Tens of thousands of protesters streamed into the streets of central Minsk Sunday, despite knowing the danger that could mean. Here is what that danger looked like. This video appears to show plainclothes officers grabbing a protester off the street, scuffling with the crowd, and finally driving away. A Russian news agency is quoting the Belarusian Interior Ministry as saying at least 125 people were detained. Riot police were out in force, greeted by chants of "shame, shame." Previous Sunday marches have been held at the city's Independence Square. That was cordoned off this week, each entrance blocked by government troops. A large crowd gathered instead at the official residence of President Alexander Lukashenko, the man they want to resign. This photo was released by Lukashenko's spokesman Sunday, showing him carrying a weapon at Independence Square. Now, the show of force came on Lukashenko's 66th birthday. For the occasion, Lukashenko did get a happy birthday call from Russian leader Vladimir Putin, a call that included an invitation to visit Moscow in the coming weeks. Lukashenko has struggled to control protests and strikes since his August 9th re-election. Critics say that vote was rigged. But Putin has made it clear Russia is prepared to help. Thursday, the Russian leader said he'd been asked by Belarus to set up a reserve police force and that it would be deployed if necessary. Now, Belarus is also cracking down on journalists. Authorities this weekend deported several foreign reporters, including AP, Reuters, and the BBC. They've also withdrawn the credentials from several domestic journalists. That means if those Belarusians continue to report, they can be arrested. Lukashenko has accused journalists of inciting the protests against him. Mike Armstrong, Global News.
Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is hinting that more Arab leaders are now in talks to normalize relations with Israel, following a deal with the United Arab Emirates. This weekend, the UAE brought an end to its formal boycott of Israel, opening the door for tourism, trade, and other business between the two countries. It's the latest step in an agreement brokered by U.S. President Donald Trump's administration earlier this month. A delegation will fly to the Gulf nation tomorrow on board the first ever Israeli commercial flight from Tel Aviv to Abu Dhabi. Joining that delegation will be President Trump's son-in-law and advisor, Jared Kushner, who met with Netanyahu in Jerusalem.
While this peace agreement was thought by many to be impossible, the stage is now set for even more. Over the last 3.5 years, a lot of people described the state of the Middle East as hopeless. But what I've felt over the last couple of weeks is a new sense of optimism, and we must seize that optimism, and we must continue to push to make this region achieve the potential that it truly has.
The deal was struck without the participation of Palestinians. Although Israel agreed to pause a planned annexation of Palestinian land in the West Bank, Palestinian leaders view it as a setback to ending Israeli occupation. A signing ceremony for the deal is expected to be held in Washington next month. Egypt and Jordan are the only Arab nations to have previously established diplomatic relations with Israel. Coming up, a dark case of déjà vu. Meet the Jewish man standing up for China's Uyghur Muslim minority. Take a look at this. A scary scene in Taiwan today. A 3-year-old girl was swept more than 9 meters into the air after becoming entangled in the strings of a large kite. The child was whipped around for a few seconds before falling to the ground. Several people rushed to help, and incredibly, her parents say she was shocked but not physically hurt. For years, we've heard allegations of China's oppression and mass incarceration of Uyghur Muslims. The UN estimates that at least 1 million members are being held against their will in detention camps, which Beijing insists are re-education camps to fight extremism. But for one Jewish man in Britain, the allegations are all too reminiscent of another dark chapter of history. Redmond Shannon has his story.
A very British Tuesday evening.
And here comes the rain.
Orthodox Jew Andrew and 8 supporters quietly protest outside a branch of the Chinese embassy in London. Staff inside keep a close eye.
When I saw the satellite images of the concentration camps that the Chinese government can't hide, I couldn't stay at home anymore. I had to get up and do something, and that's why I started protesting.
Andrew, who doesn't want his surname used, began his twice-weekly protests last year.
It's not about me, it's about getting these women and men and children out.
Standing in solidarity with at least 1 million Uyghur Muslims detained in Western China.
When I saw that he was coming on his own here, I thought I can't sit at home and let him protest for human rights abuses that involve people from my community.
Andrew says he's motivated by history.
My wife's grandparents were either gassed at Auschwitz in the extermination camp there or killed in the concentration camp there. But never before, except once in history, have millions of men, women and children been rounded up and put in concentration camps. And we know how that ended, and we said never again.
Beijing says the camps are voluntary education centres used to counter Islamic extremism. It denies allegations of torture, separating children from parents and forced sterilisation.
Don't listen to fake news. Don't listen to fabrications.
Mounting evidence, though, triggered US sanctions against China, with calls for countries like Canada to follow suit.
The reason that many countries are silenced and not taking any action is, again, like I repeatedly say, it's China's money.
Rushan Abbas's sister was put in a detention centre 2 years ago. She says what's happening is genocide, a term not being used by Western governments.
Anybody who's learned history knows what happened in the Second World War. And there are so many similarities, it seems to be happening again. And we need to stop it.
Andrew's inviting others to do something similar at Chinese embassies around the world, one evening at a time. Redmond Shannon, Global News, London.
The Italian Coast Guard conducted a rescue mission in the Mediterranean, coming to the aid of a migrant rescue vessel that was funded by the popular street artist Banksy. The boat, which was carrying more than 200 rescued migrants, put out a call for help Saturday in a series of tweets after it became stranded at sea, unable to move due to overcrowding. Now, eventually, the Italians and a ship from a German charity arrived and transferred the passengers to safety. Banksy, the secretive artist known for his social commentary, funded the boat, accusing European authorities of ignoring distress calls from migrants at sea. Still ahead, COVID-19 and the classroom. As students return to school, our team of medical experts is taking your questions about parenting in a pandemic. Thousands of students in Quebec returned to the classroom last week, and many more will follow across the country in the coming days. And besides notebooks and pencils, their school days may involve masks, cohorts, and a lot of added anxiety. To help students and parents prepare, we are joined now by Dr. Dina Kulik, a pediatrician and emergency room physician in Toronto, and Dr. Shimi Kang, a psychiatrist based in Vancouver. Thank you both so much for joining us. Our first viewer question comes from Nicole Moza, who asks, do my children have to stay home for 2 weeks every time they get a cold or flu symptoms to ensure it's not COVID-19? And do we as parents also have to miss work for a couple of weeks? So Dr. Kulik, let's start with you. Obviously, the specific rules in that regard depend on your exact school board, but what's your advice?
I think the most conservative approach would be to stay home for the next 14 days. Anyone that's been exposed to that person who has illness. The reason why, for me, is that we know we're contagious for at least 2 weeks once we're unwell. And I think it's impossible at the moment to really know if your child's illness or your illness is in fact COVID or not, because the test is pretty imperfect. I'm not sure it's very reliable or accurate in young people especially. And so if you have a negative test, I still wouldn't be making decisions about return to school based on that negative test. Instead, I think the conservative right approach at the moment, so that we don't risk putting ourselves in a second wave, would be to stay home for the next 2 weeks.
Right. And Dr. Kang, over to you next. Any advice for parents on how to talk to their children about anxieties they might have when it comes to heading back to school?
Yes, and there's definitely anxiety in those kids who are going in person, but also remote learning. They're worried about being left behind academically and social isolation. Those going in person, of course, have safety concerns. So you want to have age-appropriate questions in the sense, and I always say start with open and being open and curious. So really just ask them what's on their mind. They may have anxieties about all kinds of things. So that's a great place to start. And then guide them towards some practical problem solving, some things that you may foresee, whether it's wearing masks or staying focused online, and then really build a community and start asking them and telling them that there are people that they can also turn to within their school environment so that they can communicate their emotional concerns.
All right, thank you for that. And don't go anywhere. We've got more questions for you. We've got to take a quick break. But when we come back, students in some parts of the country will be required to wear masks when they return to school. But are face shields a viable option? We're answering more of your COVID-19 questions after the break. Welcome back. Since the start of the pandemic, Global News has been taking your questions about COVID-19 straight to the experts. And we are joined now by Dr. Dina Kulik, who's a pediatrician and emergency room physician in Toronto, and Dr. Shimi Kang, a psychiatrist based in Vancouver. Thank you both again for joining us. Dr. Kulik, let's go to you for this next question that comes from Wendy McCarthy, particularly in a context where students may be required to wear masks when they return to the classroom. She's wondering if face shields will provide adequate protection.
We don't really know. There hasn't been any big studies that have shown that they're as effective or less effective. But the idea behind a mask is that it protects your sputum, your mucus, your droplets from leaving your body and going into the air to potentially affect other people. So if the face mask goes very low or the shield goes very low, theoretically you're a bit blocked. But what I've seen in my practice and even on the street is a lot of people are wearing face shields that don't go very low. They might only go to about here, or they're moving around, et cetera. So we don't really know the answer, whether they're effective or not. When you're a child and you could wear a mask, that's what I would prefer because it's closer to your face. It's going to prevent more droplets from staying towards you versus going out into the air.
Right, good to know, and especially certainly a lot of parents wondering if it's even realistic to expect children, young children, to be wearing masks for long periods of time. Dr. Kang, over to you for this next question, and especially pertinent for students who will be doing remote learning or parents who just decide to keep their kids at home. How do you balance concerns for their physical health and COVID-19 with concerns about the impact that long-term isolation can have on their mental health?
Yes, and we're certainly seeing increased rates of loneliness. We know that in general, even before the pandemic, anxiety, social disconnection was an issue. So really making it a priority. If you're on remote learning, schedule it into your day, social connection. Prefer technology that has face and voice. So we need to see each other, hear each other's voices, and have that really scheduled like homework time where you're connecting with people in a meaningful way. We want social bonding, going deeper than just socializing. Really important for the tween and teen because their brains are more sensitive to feelings of isolation. So really, I know there's a lot to think about right now, and academics is part of it, but school is very important to keep those social connections and make that a priority.
And Dr. Kulik, last question to you, and a quick one, 30 seconds or less. This is a common one from grandparents who are now wondering, once their grandchildren return to school, should they keep their distance?
I would assume that if kids are going back to school, they're not only being exposed to 15 or 20 or more kids in their group, they are exposed to their people that are, bringing their own illnesses from their bubbles. They're the people that are higher risk, the grandparents. So I would be trying to keep the distance if you can.
And that's a heartbreaker, and unfortunately we'll have to leave it there. Dr. Dina Kulik, Dr. Shimi Kang, thank you both so much for joining us.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us. That is Global National for this Sunday. I'm Jeff Semple. Tonight's Your Canada is Campbell River, British Columbia. If you'd like to share your Canada with us, email your photos to viewers@globalnational.com. Robin Gill will be back here with you tomorrow. Have a great night.